Erwin Rommel is perhaps the most famous general, not only from the German army, but from any army in the Second World War. Even monumental figures like Montgomery, Patton, Zhukov, and Guderian don't even come close in terms of fame. Perhaps this is due to his impact being made directly against the British and Commonwealth forces, and we would go on to write the history of the war. The fact that he can be positioned as being anti-Nazi due to his untimely end makes him the perfect candidate to admire without it coming across as praising the enemy regime, which most in the English-speaking world would find abhorrent. He was, in Field Marshal Auchinleck's words, a superman with supernatural powers, according to the soldiers of the British Empire in North Africa. They were terrified of him. Instead of referring to the enemy, or the Jerrys, as in the First War, they would simply say Rommel instead. A directive had to be sent out to stop this in an attempt to fix the dropping morale. In spite of all this, not much is actually known of his life to most people except that he fought the British in North Africa and how he met his end. I'd like to begin making some bigger biographical videos such as this occasionally, so who better to start with than the most famous general of the war? Some future episodes I had in mind, if this video is well received, are figures such as Oswald Mosley and Leon de Grelle, whose names are often mentioned but not much is actually known about. That is for a later date though. Before we continue, I'd like to thank my first Patreon donator, Lobster2U, for sponsoring this video and setting up my Patreon Discord channel. If that's of any interest to any of you, even the $2 tier helps me towards my goal of being able to make these videos full time. Anything helps. The link is down below, as is my Telegram channel. Erwin Johannes Eugen Rommel was born on the 15th of November 1891 in Heidenheim, a small town in Württemberg, near Ulm. His father, also Erwin Rommel, was a schoolmaster and an expert in mathematics. His grandfather was the exact same. Erwin Sr. married the oldest daughter of Karl von Loos, the president of the Württemberg government at the time, a very important man. In 1913, Erwin's father would die suddenly after an operation, however. Erwin's mother would go on to outlive his father by 27 years, only dying in 1940. The couple had 5 children: Manfred, who died young, Helena, who became a school teacher, Erwin himself, Karl, who became almost completely crippled from malaria he caught while serving as a pilot in the Middle East during the Great War, and then finally Gerhard, who abandoned his career in architecture to become an opera singer, to the great embarrassment of the family. Erwin was described as a gentle, docile child who was small for his age. He had extremely white skin and pale hair, and he was nicknamed the White Bear as a result. School life didn't get off to a great start for Erwin. He was a terrible student with awful grades until in his teenage years he suddenly woke up and showed the mathematical talent that ran in the family, passing his examinations with excellent marks. During the summers, he would spend every free moment he could on his bicycle or in the winter on his skis. After school, he became hard-headed, practical, and careful with money, growing into all of the Württemberger stereotypes. He and his friend Keitel, no relation to the field marshal, studied aircraft. They even built a full-scale glider, which unfortunately failed to leave the ground. The two dreamed of making a life in aviation. Rommel's father would not allow this though, but Keitel went off to work at the Zeppelin works at Friedrichshafen. Instead, Erwin joined the army. The family had no military tradition, and it wasn't an aristocratic family either. Success was not guaranteed for him in this line of work. The best most from his upbringing could hope for at the time was to retire as an elderly major on a modest pension in some small town, much like his own hometown of Heidenheim. On the 10th of July 1910, he joined up with the 124th Infantry Regiment as an officer cadet. He was swiftly promoted to corporal that October, and then a sergeant that December. In March 1911, he was posted to Danzig. It was here that he would meet the love of his life, Lucia Maria Mollin, the daughter of a West Prussian landowner of Italian origin. He was head over heels immediately. Being in a garrison town, it is very easy to fall into the vices of women and alcohol. For Erwin, though, this wasn't of any interest. In his mind, he was already engaged to Lucia. After a few quiet years in Danzig, eventually, in March 1914, he was sent to a field artillery regiment in Ulm, where a few months later, they would be swept up in events and mobilized for the Great War, many never to return. From the moment he first came under fire, he stood out to the rest of his men as the perfect fighting animal. He was described by his fellow soldiers as cold, cunning, ruthless, untiring, a quick decision maker, and very brave. One of his first actions of the war was to take on a group of French soldiers while being outnumbered 5-1 and too sick with food poisoning to even sit on his horse. It was a minor skirmish of not much importance in which Erwin and his men came out on top, but it perfectly showcased his bravery. Erwin spent the first few months of the war incredibly sick, often fainting, but he put up with it and never reported himself as ill. In September 1914, he was wounded in the fire attacking 3 Frenchmen in the woods, completely alone with an empty rifle. He went on to win an Iron Cross First Class in January of the new year, by crawling through wire into the main French position and causing havoc before returning to his own lines with very few casualties, a tactic he was to reproduce many times later in the war and the coming war. He was quickly promoted to Oberlieutenant and sent to a newly formed mountain battalion, where he was given nearly an entire year's worth of training in mountain warfare in Austria. He would use this time when he was given some leave to marry Lucia in November 1916 before being sent off to Romania. From here began a series of unbelievable feats in Romania and Italy. His strategy, as in France, was to sneak behind enemy lines with a few men, often laying a telephone cable as he went, and using steep mountains to get behind the back of his targets. When behind the lines, he never hesitated to attack, no matter how few men he had, as machine gun fire in the rear would almost always send all but the best troops into a panic. In January 1917, he took the village of Gagest, taking 400 prisoners with almost no casualties with a far smaller force. Again in August, he took another Romanian position on Mount Kosna by sneaking behind the lines without sleeping for an entire week with a severely injured arm from a gunshot wound. The peak of his career in the First World War would be bailing out the Austrians when they begged for German help, a common occurrence in this war. This time in the Isonzo Valley, Rommel got behind enemy lines and led his troops to capture an enemy battery with their bayonets without a shot fired. The surrounding units quickly surrendered, leading to Rommel taking 1,000 prisoners. He then exploited the breakthrough and pushed on, capturing yet another 2,000 men and 50 officers and taking their staff cars. This wasn't enough for him, and he continued on with his men, pushing them further. They finished this epic by capturing yet another 150 officers and a whopping 9,000 men, along with 81 artillery pieces. He was awarded the Pour le Mérite for his incredible feat of bravery. After some similar exploits, he was eventually sent on leave and then given a staff appointment. To his disgust, he would spend the rest of his war in this position. After the Second World War, when interest in Rommel was at an all-time high, many authors came to men who had served with him in the First War to find out more about him. A similar trend stuck with all of them. He had a sixth sense, a kind of intuition in the field. He would also always try to minimize losses via tactics. It would seem this worked for both his own men and the enemy, judging by how many casualties he managed to take with such tactics. He would never demand anyone to do anything he would not do himself. They all described him as the best of their comrades. He was adored by his men. Whenever asked of his interests outside of fighting, his comrades would always say he had none. One man said he was sure Rommel had never read a book in his life, unless it was a military one. Maybe some fishing, but otherwise, he was entirely focused on his work as a soldier. He was 100% soldier. He was not an overly serious man like you'd expect from someone of that description. Apparently he was always joking with his men. Luckily, he would manage to avoid the gigantic reductions in the size of the army following Germany's defeat in the First World War. A solid foundation was needed to eventually rebuild the army as and when the time came. Rommel was perfect for this, a serious-minded and extremely professional young soldier. He was only 26 when the war ended. He would spend 9 years following the German defeat in the First World War, commanding the 13th Infantry Regiment as a captain in Stuttgart. He lived happily enough, Stuttgart being a lovely city in his part of the country. In 1927, he took a holiday to Italy with his wife to visit the spot where he pulled off his exploits in the war. In another holiday, they took canoes down the Rhine. He and his wife did not much care for parties, theatre, or the cinema, but they occupied all their free time with their similar interests of skiing, mountaineering, swimming, and dancing. They were a very happy couple. He was apparently a very easy man to live with. He drank very little, didn't smoke, and was very handy around the house. A man more of our time than the 1920s or 30s. He founded an old comrades association for his friends in the Württemberg Battalion. He would spend much of his free time keeping in contact with them, discussing war stories, and helping those who had had a rough go of it in the post-war world. Even in the height of the war in North Africa, he would reply to every single letter from these friends. On Christmas Eve 1928, after 12 years of marriage, Manfred, their only child, was born. Erwin enjoyed a quiet life and barely talked of his days in the Great War. When he referred to it, which was rarely, it was as a stupid and barbaric business which should never be repeated. From October 1929, he spent the next 4 years as an instructor at the infantry school at Dresden. It was here that he published his book, Infantry Tactics, based on his experiences from the First World War many years later. The book became a textbook for the Swiss army, who presented him with a golden watch. In October 1933, Rommel was given command of a mounted battalion in Goslar. He wasn't a very political man, as was the case for 90% of the German officer class at the time, but he thought Hitler had some good ideas that could help fix the key problems in Germany. Although not as big as Fan, and felt him a little extreme, he wasn't a stereotypical Prussian officer like most of his class. He didn't mind the Austrian corporal being Germany's saviour. He also wasn't bothered about the Night of the Long Knives. He felt that the SA were undisciplined thugs and only caused trouble. Later, in October 1935, he became an instructor at the famous War Academy in Potsdam. Here, he and his family lived a quiet life, but didn't mingle with upper Berlin society. As time passed, he didn't care much for the other Nazis, but he was quite fond of Hitler, and felt he was righting the wrongs of Versailles, a common view in the army. At one point, he was sent to the Hitler Youth to instill discipline in them, but quickly left this posting due to a falling out with the leadership regarding Rommel's opinion that more focus should be put on character building rather than just pure militarization and dedication to the Führer. No great drama arose from this situation, however, and Hitler, a big fan of Rommel's book published a year earlier, chose Rommel to command the battalion responsible for Hitler's personal safety. Rommel spent a huge amount of time with Hitler in the lead up to the war with Poland. He began to admire Hitler greatly and couldn't believe Hitler's ability to remember things such as troop dispositions and history. Rommel was completely on board with the invasion of Poland, understandably so, considering his connection to Danzig, where his wife's family still resided. He couldn't understand why the Allies would go to war with Germany over such a cause outside of their sphere of influence. He assumed that somehow Hitler would make them see sense that this was rightful German land. In the end, he was wrong, and he was with the Führer as they marched into Poland. Rommel was amazed at Hitler's desire to get so close to the front, putting himself in severe danger. The Second World War for Rommel began not in Poland, but in France. He was aching for a command in the field. He didn't want to spend the war attached to Hitler's defence, as much as he had grown to personally admire the man. He knew Hitler well enough to ask for the command himself, more specifically, command of a panzer division. He was given it, and took over the 7th Panzer Division, stationed on the Rhine. After 2 months' intensive training, his division was ready to go when the time came on the 10th of May, and they sped across the frontier into Belgium. For the record, this isn't going to be a play-by-play of invasions. I'm more interested in the politics of history, as well as the people and the motivations, as opposed to map autism. I don't really know or care where the 28th Ongo Bongo Division was at so-and-so a time. I'll leave that to the many experts here on YouTube with superior levels of autism to myself. After an important battle on the Meuse, and the managing to cross it with Rommel's tank in the lead, he almost met his doom the next day. His tank was put out of action by anti-tank fire, and he was hit in the face. French colonial troops, known for their extreme brutality, began approaching his tank to capture him, when luckily for Erwin, Colonel Rothenberg approached in his tank and drove them off, most likely saving his life. He quickly recovered and over the coming days broke through into the French rear. In one instance, he got so far behind enemy lines that he was stood by his tank in a stereotypical small French village when a woman approached him, asking in French with relief if he was English. Rommel recalled that he was German, and the woman called him a barbarian and ran off in horror. He would continue on against all odds behind enemy lines, capturing enemy barracks and making river crossings. The entire way, he would have issues with mass tank attacks on both his flanks and keeping up the petrol supply line, yet somehow, in 2 days, he had taken over 10,000 enemy prisoners, captured or destroyed 100 tanks, 30 armoured cars and 27 artillery pieces, at the cost of only 35 killed and 59 wounded. He was awarded the Knighthood Cross for his incredible bravery. For the first time in either war, he would come up against the British shortly, finding them a far tougher opponent than the French and narrowly escaping death whilst he and another officer were holding a map together. The other officer was killed. He had yet another close brush with death or capture when on the 29th he drove his tank into Lille to take his first bit of rest after his death-defying push forwards. To his shock, he was met with a mass of British and French soldiers. Luckily, they were as shocked as him, and Erwin had enough time to turn his tank around and get out of there before anyone could react. It would seem he had a knack for close calls. In the days leading up to the 12th of June, Rommel and his division had participated in the assault on St. Valery, and on the 12th they took 12,000 prisoners, 8,000 of them being British, including General Fortune, who chose to stay with his men rather than being evacuated, which Rommel admired him greatly for. Soon after, another 30,000 French prisoners would be taken at Cherbourg for Rommel's division alone. It seemed as if his division was unstoppable. It would appear this was the case. On the 19th, the French surrendered, and by the end of the campaign, Rommel's division had inflicted an uncountable amount of casualties on the French and British, along with a ridiculous number of prisoners, whilst his division would suffer only around 700 killed, a tiny amount compared to what was done to their opponents. Rommel, along with Guderian, were to be the heroes of the French campaign, and rightfully so. Rommel's division would go down in history as the Ghost Division. Whether this was because it was impossible to keep up communications with his division because they were so far behind enemy lines, or because of the way he appeared to the enemy out of nowhere, like a ghost, both make sense. In January 1941, Rommel was promoted to General Lieutenant and a month later appointed to the command of the German troops in Libya. Initially, his main job was simply to assist the Italians who were struggling against the British. Hitler sent his military aide-de-camp with him. The two would get on well enough, and he would be Rommel's direct line to Hitler. He wasted no time and got to work immediately in the desert. On March 21st, he was told by Army Command to prepare a plan for the reconquest of Cyrenaica, and he had until April 20th to do so. On March 31st, he attacked. He was warned not to overextend himself, yet off he sped. 9 days before the plans even returned home for Army Command to examine, Cyrenaica had been reconquered, except for Tobruk, and Rommel was standing at the Egyptian frontier. On April 3rd, Hitler told him to be careful and not to expose his flank by turning up to Benghazi, yet the city had already fallen the same day the telegram was sent. No one could believe the speed of events, be it German or British. In the desert, ground is almost meaningless. Once the enemy armour is defeated, you could drive as far as your petrol would allow you. It was all about supply depots, and civilization was sparse in North Africa. When one major objective fell, the retreat would be huge, and inversely, the gains on paper, gigantic. The British public back home staring at maps probably could not believe the disaster that had befallen them. The British decision to hold Tobruk was a risky move, but thanks to the incredible bravery of the Brits, Aussies, and New Zealanders there, along with a few other nationalities, it held. It probably saved Egypt. It was a nightmare for Rommel's supply line, and he expended a lot of men and tanks in a futile attempt to retake it. Operation Battle Axe to push Rommel back was a dismal failure, largely due to Rommel's use of anti-tank technology. According to author Desmond Young, who was there, they cut through our tanks like butter. German High Command was cautious here due to supply issues, and they also cared far more about Russia, understandably, given the gravity of the fighting there and what was at stake. No great plans against the Suez Canal had been made yet on their end. Rommel, however, had other ideas. He was cooking up grand schemes in his head of overrunning the British in Egypt, then moving on through the Middle East to prevent the flow of American supply to the Soviets, or induce Turkey to join the war on the German side, which they very well might have. Ultimately, the British had the opposite idea. Churchill, rightly or wrongly, was forcing his commanders to take the offensive, and Operation Crusader, despite being incredibly hard fought and a close call, sent Rommel packing out of Egypt and hundreds of miles backwards in an orderly fighting retreat. They had lost a lot of territory, and over half of his forces had been captured, killed, or wounded, but the army lived to fight another day. Tobruk was liberated, and the longest siege was over. Before the British even had time to digest their victory, Rommel set off on a daring, unexpected offensive. With a relatively small force, he obliterated hundreds of enemy tanks at the cost of only 30 of his own. The British were sent running back the same way they had just come from. Rommel was helped massively by High Command helping him for once. They listened to his pleas regarding supply in the Mediterranean. Usually, Rommel was losing well over half his supply. In January, Malta was harried by air attacks, and not a single ton of its shipping was lost. A massive supply of tanks reached North Africa, and Rommel continued onwards. Egypt was once again under threat, and Tobruk, which had held up for months the year before, was swept up in less than a day. Compiled with the embarrassing loss of Singapore to the Japanese, British morale was all over the place, as was public opinion. The day after the capture of Tobruk, Rommel was promoted to Field Marshal by Hitler, the youngest in the German army. He wrote to his wife, "Hitler has made me a Field Marshal, but I would much rather he had given me one more division." He appreciated the promotion, but what he really wanted was proper backing for his theatre of war, which is pretty much a one-man sideshow. Despite High Command being distracted with Russia and not seeing Rommel's vision of a glittering conquest of British Egypt, he pushed on relentlessly. Wave after wave of British counterattacks was swatted off, and despite severe supply issues, minefields, and being down to half a cup of water per day per man in the hot desert sun, Rommel pushed his men all the way up to the El Alamein line. He was practically at the gates of Alexandria. It was only 65 miles away, not much in the vast North African desert of nothingness. He was at the peak of his career, given the minor task of assisting the Italians and holding off the British assault. Instead, he had taken the bull by the horns and driven the Brits back to within striking distance of the heart of Egypt and the Suez Canal. He had won the respect of his men by sharing the exact same rations as them, and never tiring. Much like Napoleon, he slept on the go. A few minutes at the wheel of his car in his case, and he awoke completely refreshed. He was nearly 50, but dealt with the privations of the desert as well as anyone 30 years younger. He would constantly check up on his men in even the most remote of positions, driving himself there in his staff car, putting himself in danger. He certainly didn't mind putting himself in the firing line. Frequently, he would drive around his men's positions in an attempt to see things from the enemy's point of view. His vehicle was shot several times. He had escaped death many times yet again, as in France. He seemed to have a sixth sense, as mentioned of him in the First War. Everyone seemed to have a story. On one occasion, Erwin told an officer at a command post, "I don't like this, you should move." There was nothing special about the position. An hour later, it was hit with a surprise assault and overrun. He was truly something special. He might have had the best mind for warfare and tactics than anyone in the world at the time. Perhaps he did have that sixth sense, after all. On the flip side, from all accounts of his generals, he was hard to deal with, he was not sensitive to senior officers. He could be tough and brutal, in fact. He was notoriously impatient, and to him, nothing was impossible. Thus his wild plans, entirely of his own doing, to sweep through Egypt into Persia or the Caucasus. Whilst certainly a heroic commander, everyone has their flaws, and he frequently overextended his armies to obvious effect. Hitler is lambasted for this same trait. Rommel should not be exempt too. One thing that not enough praise can ever be heaped on Rommel for is his impeccable treatment of prisoners of war, and the example he set for his troops in that regard. This wasn't the trenches of World War I where massacring POWs was rampant, or even worse, the Eastern Front happening at the same time. The capture of POWs and their treatment on both sides was about as humane as can be during a war. There were many stories of prisoners being able to hold on to their golden cigarette cases, watches, and the like. It was all very gentlemanly. The prisoners ate the same rations as the German army. British orders were found several times ordering the mistreatment of prisoners and using tactics such as starvation to get better results from interrogation. Rommel always made sure these didn't get leaked to his men so that they wouldn't act up against their own prisoners in return. Part of the reason Rommel is so looked up to in the British history of World War II, I would imagine, is due to his boundless, chivalrous behaviour. Ultimately, it wasn't to be. Supply was difficult and the Germans were losing control of the Mediterranean, making the problem worse. Rommel attempted to push on Egypt regardless. He had no choice. The British were now commanded by the famous Bernard Montgomery, and they had air superiority. Rommel even said he wished he could cancel the attack on the very same day he launched it. He knew it was useless. After an intense back and forth, there was only going to be one winner. The German army couldn't break through, and Montgomery was the victor of El Alamein. To make matters worse, Rommel was ill and had to return to Germany to seek treatment. Whilst here, he met Hitler, who made him many vague promises about support to help Rommel capture Egypt, which all sounded ridiculous and too good to be true. As the weeks in Germany passed, news flooded back of disaster in Africa. Hitler offered Rommel a posting in Ukraine instead, but this was never an option for Erwin. He was going back to his men. Within 2 days of being in a hospital bed in Germany, he was back in Africa, launching a counterattack. However, it was a futile one. He never stood a chance against the superior British forces. He'd lost more tanks than could possibly be recovered, and success was never an option. To make things worse, a Führer order came in saying that no retreat would be allowed from El Alamein. Rommel was caught in two minds and stuck in an impossible situation. At the same time, British and American troops were streaming into French Morocco, although more time would pass before it happened. Africa was essentially a lost cause for the Germans. A gigantic but controlled retreat followed all the way back into Libya. Rommel went to Germany to see Hitler to tell him that it was hopeless, but Hitler made vague promises that he could rescue the situation before losing his temper at Rommel, telling him to get out of the room and to stop being a defeatist. Rommel did so before being called back, and the issue being discussed more calmly. Hitler softened on Rommel's idea of withdrawing from Africa. He then spent some time with Goering to discuss getting his troops out, but it came to no good. He'd had enough and went back to be with his troops in Africa. The enemy were closing in from both sides of North Africa, and his time was up. He tried one more counterattack, which for a few days brought incredible panic to the Allies, and they felt all their progress would come crashing down. But ultimately, they quickly solved the situation, and the nail was put in the German coffin. Rommel was incredibly sick and covered in desert sores by this point, and flew back to Germany. Whether he needed more treatment, the most likely option, or if he was summoned by Hitler is unknown, but his Africa corps would go into captivity without him. It was too late to evacuate them all. He was summoned to the Berghof to talk to Hitler, and Hitler admitted he was wrong and that the troops must be evacuated, as Rommel had said at their last meeting, but as mentioned, it was too late. After a few weeks spent in hospital, Rommel was posted to northern Italy near Lake Garda, then to Greece for 24 hours before swiftly returning to Italy when it was clear Italy was on the verge of deposing Mussolini and changing sides, which they did. Here things were largely uneventful, and apart from one incident where he tried to prevent the SS looting their former allies for food and valuables, nothing much happened. This was no place for a man like Rommel. To him, it was uneventful. He was happier with his special mission that was given to him shortly by Hitler to inspect the Atlantic Wall, despite this not sounding much more interesting. He found the defences in a disgraceful state, and the men, in his opinion, even more disgraceful. Many of the men manning the concrete structures along the coast were conscripts from the east who couldn't care less, or Germans who weren't fit to fight on the Eastern Front. Rommel complained to his wife about having to issue orders several times and them still not following through. He missed the camaraderie and loyalty of his men in Africa. It would probably have been better for Rommel to be in Allied captivity like his men. Personally, he most likely would have been treated like royalty with how chivalrous the war in Africa was. Nevertheless, he set about making changes enthusiastically. He tried to divert the necessary steel resources away from other uses like Hitler's V1 and V2 rocket sites and set about scaling up the mine-laying operations massively. In a few months, he laid 4 million mines, as opposed to the less than 2 million in the previous 3 years. If he had been given more time, he proposed to lay 50 to 100 million, but that was time he did not have. The Allies were evidently gearing up for an invasion, and he felt there was no way, no matter how much work he could do in the little time he had, to stop them. He did, however, try his best. Much like the Allies had blow-up dummy tanks on the English side of the Channel to fool Axis reconnaissance flights, Rommel had dummy bunkers, which fooled the Allied air forces, and many bombs were wasted on them. All sorts of booby traps of what little resources he could scrape together for the defences were put to use on the shore, like naval mines, tank obstacles, and all kinds of weird handmade mines. This was Rommel through and through. On his retreat through North Africa, he had done much the same to great effect against the British, laying traps as he went. Not enough of these can be completed this time around, however. A serious bone of contention laid in where to place the panzers for the defence of the coast. Rommel felt that they were best placed right near the coast. Hitler was inclined to agree, but the overall commander of the area, von Rundstedt, felt it was best to keep them back so they could be more easily deployed depending on where the Allies landed, rather than gambling on one location. Both were logical, but the panzers hung back. They would not get to the coast in time when the moment came, and the Allies were not swept back into the sea, as hoped. The invasion was a disaster for the Germans, but there was not much they could do, no matter if Rommel got his way, or even if he had a little more time. Allied air power was absolutely overwhelming. They had complete control of France, and before units could even reach the front, they were bombed to pieces, whether by foot, car, or railroad. As the invasion progressed, Hitler was induced to attend a conference with von Rundstedt and Rommel. The two of them tried to talk Hitler into making peace with the Allies. Throwing them back into the sea was impossible, and it would only get more Germans killed to carry it on. Rommel and Hitler were not on the same rosy terms as they were near the beginning of the war, and Hitler's reply saying that no retreat or peace must take place was very predictable. At another meeting soon afterwards, Rommel and Hitler's relationship boiled over further when Hitler tried blaming the success of the Allied landings on him. Things went from bad to terrible for Rommel. On the 17th of July, the Allied Air Force strafed his vehicle. A cannon shell shattered his driver's left shoulder and left arm, and Rommel was hit in the face by broken glass and received a blow to the temple and cheekbone, causing a triple fracture of the skull, and he immediately lost consciousness. Another aircraft flew over and tried to drop bombs on the injured men laying on the ground. His driver died, and the French doctor at a religious hospital, who his men managed to get him to, didn't think he would make it. 2 days before he was wounded, he had sent Hitler a strongly worded message essentially describing the situation as untenable and going over in detail the many issues he faced, most of all, the intense Allied bombings. They didn't stand a chance with the Allies bombing them at will. Von Kluge, the new overall commander in France, sent a letter attached to Rommel's, agreeing with him and stressing the point even more strongly than Rommel had. The German people were being annihilated, and there was no way to win this war. They were right, but war isn't as simple as that. Near the end of February in 1944, before all of the recent disasters, a 6-hour interview was conducted inside Rommel's home between himself and a Dr. Karl Strolin. The purpose was to recruit Rommel to the cause of overthrowing Hitler. The interest in Rommel came from the idea that he could be the future leader of Germany, whether that be temporary or permanent. Conspirators were abundant, but no one stuck out. There was no superstar, or anyone the German public knew that much or trusted. To the conspirators, Rommel was that man. A man seen as a hero in Germany and admired by the Allies. A man they could come to terms with. To the more skeptical, Rommel had been set up in Nazi propaganda as a textbook Nazi, someone to aspire to be like. He was the perfect figurehead to please all parties, if an overthrow were to take place. According to Dr. Strolin, quote, neither then nor any time afterwards was he aware of the plan to kill Hitler. Later in the interview, Rommel, again according to Dr. Strolin, said, I believe it is my duty to come to the rescue of Germany. Rommel called another meeting later, although he did not attend every meeting between the conspirators. He was kept informed on everything, however. His will to bring the war to an end by whatever cost was strengthened by a strange source. He met with Ernst Junger, author of Storm of Steel, probably the best soldier's account of the First World War in the eyes of non-pacifists. He had drafted a piece designed on the basis of Christianity and that Europe may set itself up to counter Bolshevism, although at the time this would have been dismissed as nonsense by the Allies and laughed at. This was an honourable plan, and he was right in the long run. Rommel found it incredibly moving and was anxious for it to be published when the right time came. He had one foot in two camps. On the one hand, he was helping Hitler to defend the coast, and he put in his all. On the other, he was ready to join in a plot, to what degree is not known, to overthrow him, or at least he knew about it. When the famous attempt on Hitler's life was made on July 20th, things came to a head. Von Kluge was implicated too, although not a key player. He chose to kill himself instead. He made his driver take him on a tour of his World War I battlefields before wandering off and shooting himself. It failed, and he instead took out his eye. A little later, he swallowed cyanide. Rommel, however, was recovering well from his wounds. He was at first expected to die, but now he was growing stronger and stronger by the day. This was to change, though. On the 14th of October, General Bergdorf came to speak to him. His driver was wearing an SS uniform. He asked to speak to Rommel alone, so his wife went upstairs. When Bergdorf and his men left the room, Rommel was not with them. He went to see his wife upstairs. Frau Rommel explains, as he entered the room, there was so strange and terrible an expression on his face that I exclaimed at once, "What is the matter with you? What has happened? Are you ill?" Rommel looked back and replied, "I have come to say goodbye. In a quarter of an hour, I shall be dead. They suspect me of having taken part in the attempt to kill Hitler. It seems my name was on Goedeler's list to be the president of the Reich. I have never seen Goedeler in my life. They say that von Stulpnagel, General Speidel, and Colonel von Hofacker have denounced me. It is the usual trick. I have told them that I do not believe it, and it cannot be true. The Führer has given me the choice of taking poison or being dragged before the People's Court. They have brought the poison. They say it will only take 3 seconds to act. Rommel's wife obviously begged him to go to court instead. Rommel simply replied saying that he would never make it to Berlin alive. As Rommel was about to leave the room, his son arrived in front of the generals. He said goodbye to his son. He had been promised that no harm would befall his family if he took the poison, a state funeral would be provided, and his full field marshal's pension given to his family. So he did not attempt to escape. Rommel got in the car with the generals and drove away. Within 20 minutes, Rommel was dead and an accident staged. In the end, Erwin Rommel is unique in the most divided story of our time. Whether you're an ardent Nazi or an Anglo-Saxon capitalism enjoyer, perhaps even if you're a communist, you can appreciate and even admire Erwin Rommel. This is true of almost no one else in the war that changed our world forever. Tensions still run extremely high 80 years later. Whilst a lot is made of his untimely end, it isn't surprising that it happened. People were killed for treason in Britain even after the war. It isn't a great leap to imagine that this happened in Nazi Germany. The fact of the matter is, Rommel knew of a conspiracy, no matter how detailed, to overthrow Hitler, and knew everyone involved whom was important. He didn't report this and held on to the information for months. When his name was brought up as a potential replacement for Hitler, it isn't hard to imagine why an incredibly stressed and paranoid Hitler would want him taken care of, even if he wasn't 100% sure. This doesn't make it right. There is no doubt in my mind that Rommel had no intention of partaking in the killing of Hitler, but the fact of the matter is, he did technically commit treason by not reporting the planned overthrow to whatever extent he knew of it. It's one of those situations you cannot get out of. If he reported them, people he liked would be killed for treason. If he held on to the information, it could happen to himself, as it did. This is just one of the unfortunate situations that can spiral out of control in war. The ones who say Erwin's death was a completely unheard of travesty, as the line goes in most history books, are simply wrong. That takes nothing away from the man though. Whilst being guilty, to whatever level, of treason, most, even modern day Nazis, respect and love him, and understand the unenviable position he was in. Rommel will be talked about for centuries to come. He was both a great military leader and a great man, and he was truly one of the most important figures of his time. He set an example for how war should be waged, even in our age of industrialized slaughter with artillery, bombs, and gas. He conducted a chivalrous campaign in the most barbarous war imaginable. For that alone, he should go down in the history books.